A Guten Erev Shabbos. We should acknowledge that this Shabbat, a new King of Canada is being crowned. King of United Kingdom also, but of Canada as well. This has not been the subject of very much talk at the Kiddush. Perhaps people are waiting to see how it all unfolds. Fair enough. Let's wait for the coverage and the analysis and see what lessons are to be learned. At this point, suffice it to say that Malchus, royalty, sovereignty, is something that we speak about every day. We understand there's an extent to which what happens here in our mortal, temporal world reflects what's happening on high. We even emphasized Thursday that Malchus Shebenetzach was the Sfiras HaOmer focus of the day. So we'll discuss this further at some point soon. Also, suffice it to say that this is something of a mystical time, not only with this manifestation of Malchus, of sovereignty, kingship. We also have, coming up this week, Lag BaOmer, the yortzeit of Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who's credited by the tradition with authorship of the Zohar, the basic text of Jewish mysticism. It's most fascinating not just to explore mysticism on its own, but to see the coming together of rationalism and mysticism. That's probably some of the appeal of Rambam, maybe even of Rabbi Yosef Karo, author of Shulchan Aruch, and certainly Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik. Rabbi Soloveitchik is the intellectual father of North American modern orthodoxy and a cornerstone of rationalist Torah thought and scholarship in the Brisker Derech, the methodology developed by his ancestors. Since it's a Soloveitchik family tradition not to publish, or not to publish much, during their lifetimes, the last 30 years since he passed away have been dedicated to gathering, editing, and publishing Rabbi Soloveitchik's writings and scholarship and lectures. Rabbi Soloveitchik was president of Mizrachi, the religious Zionist organization, and he used to give a keynote address at the annual Mizrachi convention. So in this ongoing project of gathering and publishing his works, a few years ago already, the OU Press came out with a collection of these talks as they were originally delivered in Yiddish, titled Drashas wegen Shivas Tzion and Kiyama Ummah, or drashas on sermons on talks on the return to Zion and Jewish destiny. Last week they came out with an English edition, which curiously has one additional talk and is half the page length as the Yiddish. That's going to take some investigation as to figure out why. Anyway, each of these talks is fascinating and worth looking into and getting some more perspective on the nexus of Zionism and traditional Judaism. As you well know, they are not an automatic shidduch. There are many Zionists in the world who do not necessarily consider themselves traditionally religious, and vice versa. Some self-identifying religious people who do not see themselves in the Zionist camp, or fully in the Zionist camp, let's say. Rabbi Soloveitchik considered himself both, and how he navigated that balance is revealing and informative. Another aspect is that when he would speak at these conventions, he would speak for 2 or 2.5 hours. First of all, he was a very well-respected and revered figure, meaning people were looking forward to hearing what he had to say. Second, probably people's attention spans were longer than that, particularly for important ideas. One of the talks in this new collection is titled The Letters of Creation, and it's really a celebration of and an emphasis on the basics of Jewish life, particularly on educating and influencing the next generations. He begins this talk quoting a Gemara in Sanhedrin that Rav Hanina and Rav Oshaya would spend every Erev Shabbos, Friday afternoon, Friday evening maybe, engaged in studying Sefer Yetzirah, the mystical text that contains the secrets of creation. Rabbi Soloveitchik doesn't quote the Gemara to say exactly what they did with this knowledge, but he notes that the Geonim make a textual emendation, an edit here. They say that these sages studied not Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, but rather Otiot Yetzirah, the letters of formation or creation. What's the distinction? Rabbi Soloveitchik says that there are times when the project that we're called to engage in is really Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation. As he says, quote, improving and perfecting creation, in the work of formulating more sublime, higher and loftier values and ideas, in elevating man to a higher plane, spreading the knowledge of God, deepening Jewish thought, sowing abstract Talmudic thought, and making "this is my God and I will exalt him" a reality. End of quote. In contrast, there are other eras where the task is different and in many ways more basic. It's really the work of square one, working with creatio ex nihilo, starting from scratch, as it were, the ABCs of Jewish existence. This is not the great and all-encompassing Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, but rather, as the Gaonim make the edit, Otiot Yetzirah, Oisius Yetzirah, the letters of creation. These are times when great Jewish leaders cannot allow themselves the luxury of disseminating wisdom and knowledge, but rather must begin with the Aleph of Yetzirah, of creation. He says the great publications and great conferences and great pronouncements will not accomplish the task of the age in our times. Remember, as he says simply, and this is after all a Rosh Yeshiva, a scion of a great intellectual dynasty with a PhD in philosophy from the University of Berlin, he says what we must do is dress Jewish children in tzitzis and tell them about the God of Israel and his Torah. He says education must be in the example of Elisha, who revived a child, not with logic, not with proofs or great insights, but with warmth, with life, with breath. It has to be accomplished with warmth and love and emotion, not simply axioms and theorems and rules. We read this passage a few months ago from 2 Kings, Melachim Beis, as a haftarah for Vayera. The child, he says, must be endowed with a new soul, not simply taught a few pages of Gemara. If the letters of the Aleph, Bet, are not taught with sanctity, with holiness, one cannot later teach them Gemara. There must be a qualitative renaissance in education, not just a quantitative addition to it. In other words, Rabbi Soloveitchik is saying Yiddishkeit is not only an intellectual exercise, a purely scholastic or pedagogical science. Rather, it has to be a living, breathing tradition. It has to be alive, not a museum relic, an embracing and vitalizing way of life, and not simply a hobby or an interest or nostalgia. It has to mean something, which really means it has to mean everything. His critics, he quotes in the talk, say, "Be patient, we'll raise money, these things take time, it's a project," and so on. To these critics, Rabbi Soloveitchik replies, to what is this compared? It's like a person who wishes to learn to swim, but is afraid to jump in the water. As long as he cannot swim, he considers it dangerous to go in. But in order to acquire the skill of swimming, he must get wet. We call this taking the plunge. You can't learn to swim without getting wet. He decries the morphing of Toras Chaim, a living and breathing tradition, into a collection of quaint rituals and antique beliefs and folkways, and obviously sees no future in that kind of nostalgia. Rather, what we have to do is jump in and get wet. That's how you acquire the skills. Rashi's first comment in our parsha of Emor this week is to note that there's a double expression of Emor and Amarta, say and tell or relate, in the first opening verse of Parshat Emor, the verse that directs the older Kohanim to instruct the younger Kohanim, to initiate those Kohanim into the ways of their tribe, is how Rashi explains it. Lahazhir gedolim al hakatanim, he explains. The word lahazhir is to caution or to instruct, and with the awesome power of the Hebrew language, the same word means to cause to shine. The same word as Zohar, the book of radiance or splendor, authored by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who, as we said, his yortzeit is this week, Tuesday, Lag BaOmer. This strain of interpretation and understanding and investigation into our people's wisdom looks beyond the surface of behavioral norms. In other words, what we're supposed to do and how and when we're supposed to do it, which are extremely important. And it finds the meanings behind and within the actions. Let's agree that no one in any field of endeavor, sports, medicine, arts, technology, any profession or avocation, can do well without mastery of the technical points. A musician has to learn the basics of the instrument. An athlete has to master the fundamentals of the game. and then practice. In one view, Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell says 10,000 hours to gain mastery of the skill. Even that is not on its own enough to become an expert or a virtuoso. From there, one has to get into the soul of the thing, the meaning behind it and within it, and that's what makes it radiant. And that is certainly no less so with our Jewish life. The ABCs are essential. Understanding the how and the what and the when are the without which nots of Jewish life. We have to know how to daven, how to do tshuva, how to look at the world around us through the lens of Yiddishkeit, make sense out of it, and where we are in relation to it. And then there's more. We look deeper to find the meanings behind what we're doing, to see the light shining in every mitzvah, every connection, every moment. When we get the fundamentals under our belts, that only helps us make sense of the deeper meanings. Rabbi Soloveitchik delivered this talk when? What would be your guess? Give yourself a second. October of 1944. Imagine what a state the world was in October of 1944. Imagine what a state the Jewish people was in 1944 in October, as the great centers of Jewish life in Europe and Russia were quite literally going up in smoke. Still, Rabbi Soloveitchik in his time, as Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the Mishnah some 18 centuries earlier, called us to the task at hand. Rabbi Shimon lived right after the destruction of the Second Temple and exile from our land. Rabbi Soloveitchik lived before, during, and after the modern-day Churban, the violent extinguishing of Judaism, the vanished world of European Jewry. In another lecture in this book, he argues that this Churban was even more catastrophic than the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem that Rabbi Shimon witnessed. Yet neither one despaired. Neither despaired. They saw the task of rebuilding as the ongoing Jewish call to action, no matter what the circumstances. The destruction, the Churban that each saw in their generation simply meant that the effort required would be that much greater to rise to the challenge of the times. We saw in Pirkei Avos recently the famous adage of Rabbi Tarfon: it's not upon you to complete the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. Lo alecha hamalacha ligmor, velo ata ben chorin lehibatel mimena. We can all take this time, this precious time, now that we're more than halfway from slavery to Sinai, halfway between Pesach and Shavuos, the time of the giving of the Torah, to re-examine our own letters of creation, our Oisius Yetzira, and align them and recombine them and use them to create a new spirit and a new time of the age. May we see together the continued blessings of all our efforts in good health. A good Shabbos.